All right, so we're going to be taking a deep dive into this book, Behaviorism by John B. Watson.
Yeah.
And I'm really excited about this one because this is
Yeah.
one that you recommended, and I know you're really interested in psychology
Yeah.
and how we understand human behavior and stuff.
Yeah.
Uh, and this book, I mean, it's a classic for a reason. I think it really kind of shakes things up.
Absolutely.
And so I'm excited to kind of break down some of the key ideas with you today.
Yeah, it's fascinating how Watson kind of just throws out a lot of the traditional ways of thinking about psychology.
Yeah.
Like he wants to shift the focus from these internal, invisible things like,
Huh.
the soul or consciousness
Yeah.
to something much more concrete, observable
Right.
behavior.
Behavior, yeah.
Yeah,
I can see why that would be kind of controversial.
absolutely.
It's like he's saying, forget all those abstract concepts.
Let's just look at what people actually do.
Exactly. He's pushing for this more scientific approach.
Right. One that relies on observation experimentation rather than introspection,
Yeah.
which he sees as really subjective and unreliable.
Okay.
Think of it this way. He wants to study humans with the same rigor that a physicist studies the laws of motion.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But how do you go about studying something as complex as human behavior
Right.
in such a scientific way?
That's where this concept of conditioning comes in.
Okay.
This is a key principle in behaviorism,
Yeah.
and it's all about understanding how we learn to respond to different stimuli in our environment.
So like Pavlov's dogs, right?
Got it.
They learn to associate the sound of a bell with food, and eventually they start drooling just at the sound of the bell, even without the food.
Exactly. But Watson takes this idea much further.
Okay.
He argues that conditioning shapes our behavior from a very early age. And it's not just about simple reflexes like salivating.
Right.
He gives this example of an Airedale dog that learned to jump up.
Oh, wow.
Whenever its owner simply rose from a chair,
Just the motion of them getting up.
it's just that little movement.
Wow.
And think about how many of our own daily actions are driven by similar conditioned responses.
It's kind of mind-blowing to think about how much of our behavior might be driven by these unconscious learned associations.
Absolutely, and Watson takes it to an even more radical conclusion.
Yeah, okay.
He argues that there are no true instincts in humans.
Okay.
Everything we do, from the way we walk to the language we speak,
Oh,
is
wow.
learned through conditioning.
Wait, so you're telling me something like a mother's instinct to protect her child?
Yeah.
That's not actually an instinct.
Nope, not according to Watson.
Okay.
He'd argue that what we call instincts are really just complex sets of learned behaviors shaped by our environment and experiences.
Okay.
He compares it to a boomerang.
Okay.
It's not some mystical returning instinct that makes it come back.
Right.
It's the design of the boomerang,
Yeah.
the way it's thrown,
Yeah.
that makes it work.
So our genes might provide a basic blueprint, but it's our experiences that really mold who we become.
Precisely. He uses this example of handedness.
Okay.
We're not born right-handed or left-handed, he argues.
Okay.
It's the way we're raised and the constant reinforcement from our culture that shapes that behavior.
That really challenges the notion of nature versus nurture,
It does.
doesn't it?
Yeah.
If even something as basic as handedness
Yeah.
is learned, then what else might we be attributing to our genes
Right.
that's actually a product of our environment?
It's a profound question,
Yeah.
and it gets to the heart of what Watson is trying to do with behaviorism.
Oh, yeah.
He wants us to understand that we are incredibly malleable creatures, and our experiences have a far greater impact on who we are than we might realize.
Yeah, this is already making me rethink some of my own assumptions.
I know, right?
What about emotion?
Oh, yeah.
Does Watson believe that those are learned as well?
Absolutely. He challenges the traditional view that we're born with this set of basic emotions. Instead, he argues that even emotions are bodily responses that are conditioned by our experiences.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Can you give me an example of how he sees that working?
He talks about how infants have a few very basic, unlearned emotional responses,
Okay.
like fear, rage, and love.
Okay.
But he doesn't see these as fixed innate patterns.
Okay.
Instead, he focuses on the specific observable reactions that
Yeah.
infants have to certain stimuli.
Okay.
For instance, a loud sound might trigger a fear response.
Right.
Restraint might trigger rage. Stroking might trigger a love response. response.
So those basic reactions become the building blocks for our emotional lives.
Exactly. Through conditioning, those initial responses get linked to all sorts of new stimuli,
Yeah.
and our emotional repertoire expands.
All right.
So that initial fear of loud noises might eventually evolve into a fear of thunderstorms or even social situations.
So even something as complex and nuanced as our emotional lives
Right.
can be traced back to these basic conditioned responses.
That's the idea.
Hmm.
And this raises an important question.
Okay.
If our fears and other negative emotions are learned,
Yeah.
can we also unlearn them?
That's a hopeful thought.
Yeah.
Does Watson offer any insights into how that might work?
He does, and this is where things get really exciting.
Okay.
He conducted this groundbreaking research on unconditioning fear responses,
Okay.
and his work suggests that we can indeed overcome learned fears.
So he's saying we can unlearn our fears,
Yeah,
that we can learn to not be afraid of things.
exactly.
And that's a pretty powerful idea.
It is.
I'm curious to hear how he approached this. Like, how did he actually go about unconditioning these fear responses?
Well, one of his most famous experiments involved this little boy named Peter,
Okay.
who was terrified of rabbits.
Uh-huh.
And Watson and his team were able to help Peter overcome his fear
Okay.
through this process called direct conditioning.
Direct conditioning.
They would basically bring the rabbit closer and closer to Peter
While he was like holding it.
when he was eating.
Oh, while he was eating. Okay.
Yeah, so they were associating the rabbit with something pleasurable.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
So by slowly exposing him to the rabbit in a safe and positive environment,
Right.
they were able to change his emotional response.
Exactly. And Watson's work has had this huge impact on how we approach things like phobias and anxiety disorders today.
Yeah.
It's really the foundation of behavioral therapies that help people unlearn their fears.
That's amazing. I mean, it's incredible to think that something as debilitating as a phobia can be unlearned.
It is.
But I have to admit, a part of me is still wondering
Yeah.
if we're basically just a collection of learned responses.
Right.
What does that say about things like free will
Right.
or individuality?
It's the big question. And
Yeah.
and it's one that Watson definitely grapples with. I mean,
Oh.
he doesn't shy away from the implications of his ideas.
Yeah.
In fact, he uses this framework of conditioning to explain things like personality development, too.
So how does he define personality then?
Right.
If it's not about innate traits or predispositions.
He sees personality as the sum total of our habits,
Okay.
which are essentially just patterns of learned behavior.
Okay.
And just like any other behavior, he believes our habits are shaped by our experiences and the environment we're in.
So if I have a habit of, say, procrastinating,
Yeah.
it's not because I was born a procrastinator,
Yeah.
but because I've learned to respond to certain situations in that way.
Exactly. And just as we can unlearn fears,
Right.
we can also unlearn and relearn habits,
Okay.
including those that make up our personality.
That's encouraging to hear.
Yeah.
It's not like we're stuck with a certain personality type for our entire lives.
Not at all. Watson believes that personality is dynamic and ever-changing. He compares it to taking a cross-section of our complete organization at any given moment.
Okay.
It's like a snapshot of our dominant habit systems,
Okay.
but those systems are constantly evolving.
So it's like our personality is a work in progress,
Yeah.
constantly being shaped by our experiences.
That's a great way to put it, and this has big implications for things like self-improvement and personal growth.
Yeah.
If our personalities are malleable, then we have the power to change and become the people we want to be.
This is really resonating with me.
Good.
It makes so much sense when you think about how our environment and experiences shape us.
Yeah.
But how does this learning actually happen?
Right.
What's the mechanism behind it?
Well, Watson emphasizes the importance of what he calls frequency and recency.
Okay.
In simple terms, the more often we repeat a behavior and the more recently we've done it,
Okay.
the stronger the habit becomes.
So the more we do something,
Yeah.
the more likely you are to keep doing it.
Exactly. It's like wearing a path in the woods.
Yeah.
The more you walk it, the deeper it gets.
So practice really does make perfect.
Right.
Or at least it makes for stronger habits.
Exactly. And this applies to all sorts of learning,
Okay.
from physical skills to mental habits to social interactions.
Okay, so we've talked about how conditioning shapes our emotions,
Right.
our personality.
Uh-huh.
But how does it apply to something as complex as language?
Well, Watson actually spends a good chunk of his book breaking down how language is learned through conditioning as well.
Oh, wow.
He sees it as this system of verbal habits that we develop over time.
So babies aren't born with this innate understanding of language.
Nope.
Okay.
They start with those basic sounds like crying and cooing.
Yeah.
And through interactions with their caregivers,
Right.
they learn to associate those sounds with objects and actions.
So it's like they're building up a vocabulary through this series of conditioned responses.
That's right. And as they get older, they start stringing those words together into sentences,
Right.
again, through conditioning and reinforcement from the people around them.
It's amazing how this seemingly effortless process of learning language is actually this complex web of conditioned responses.
It is.
But it's not just about spoken language, right? What
Right.
about things like reading and writing?
Those are learned through conditioning, too. Think about it when you were learning to read.
Yeah.
You had to connect those abstract symbols on the page with sounds and meanings.
Right.
That's all about building new associations.
And then writing is essentially taking those verbal habits and translating them into a physical act.
Precisely. It all comes back to this idea that we're constantly building and refining our skills and knowledge through this process of conditioning and habit formation.
So we've talked about all these different aspects of learning, but one thing I'm still curious about is creativity.
Mm-hmm.
If our behavior is so shaped by our environment and past experiences,
Right.
where does that leave room for something like creativity?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And it pushes us to think about the nuances of behaviorism.
Okay.
While Watson emphasizes this power of conditioning,
Yeah.
he doesn't suggest that we're just mindless robots reacting to stimuli,
Okay.
right? He acknowledges that we can combine our learned responses in new and unique ways,
Okay.
leading to what might appear to be spontaneous creativity.
So it's like taking the building blocks of our experiences
Right.
and kind of rearranging them into something new.
Exactly. Imagine a child learning to build with blocks.
Like it.
They first learn the basic shapes and how to stack them,
Right.
but as they gain experience, they can start experimenting,
Yeah.
creating more elaborate and imaginative structures.
Okay.
It's the same with our learned behaviors. We can draw on our repertoire of responses and combine them in ways that go beyond our initial conditioning.
That makes me think about the power of exposure to different ideas and experiences.
Yeah.
The more we learn, the more material we have to work with.
Absolutely. Watson was a big advocate for education
Okay.
and believed it played this crucial role in shaping individuals and society as a whole.
So he saw learning as this lifelong process,
Exactly.
not something that ends when we finish school.
Not at all.
Okay, this has been really interesting. But one thing that comes to mind when we talk about behavior being shaped by the environment is manipulation. If someone understands these principles of conditioning, couldn't they use them to kind of control others?
It's a valid concern and one that Watson himself addressed.
Okay.
He believed that the principles of behaviorism could be used for both good and bad.
Yeah.
Just like any scientific discovery,
Right.
it can be applied in ethical and unethical ways.
So it's about understanding the power of these principles,
Yeah,
but also recognizing the responsibility that comes with that knowledge.
exactly.
Yeah.
It underscores the importance of critical thinking and ethical considerations
Okay.
when applying these ideas in real-world settings.
This makes me rethink how we approach things like education,
Yeah,
advertising, even parenting.
absolutely.
If we understand how behavior is shaped,
Yeah.
we can create environments that foster positive development.
That's one of the most exciting aspects of behaviorism.
Yeah.
It offers this framework for understanding not just individual behavior, but also how societies function
Right.
and how we can create systems that promote well-being and progress.
It seems like a really powerful tool for social change then.
Watson certainly believed that he argued that societal norms,
Okay.
customs, even our morals, are learned behaviors. And just like individual habits,
Yeah.
they can be modified through conditioning.
So if we want to tackle issues like prejudice or inequality,
Yeah.
we need to understand the conditioning that perpetuates those behaviors and then find ways to disrupt those patterns.
That's a key insight of behaviorism.
Okay.
It encourages us to move beyond simply labeling behaviors as good or bad,
Yeah.
and instead focus on understanding the environmental factors that shape them.
Totally.
Once we understand those influences,
Yeah.
we can start to design interventions that promote positive change.
So it's a more proactive approach
It is.
than just saying, oh, the world is a terrible place and that's just the way it is.
Exactly.
It suggests we actually have the power to shape our destinies,
Yeah,
both individually and collectively.
that's the legacy of Watson's behaviorism. It challenges us to think critically about the forces that shape us
Yeah.
and to embrace this possibility of using our understanding of behavior to create a better world.
This deep dive has been incredibly insightful.
I'm glad you hear that.
Behaviorism has given us a lot to think about and a new lens through which to view ourselves and the world around us.
Yeah.
It's challenged some of our assumptions.
It has.
and opened up, I think, some new possibilities for understanding human behavior.
Absolutely.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today,
We have.
and I really appreciate you taking the time to break down these ideas with me.
It's been my pleasure.
And for our listeners out there, we hope this exploration has sparked your curiosity and encouraged you to continue pondering the complexities of human behavior.
Absolutely. After all, as Watson reminds us, learning is a lifelong journey.